Mocks Pam Bondi. Big mistake. The man had no idea who he was dealing with. It all started on a routine first-class flight, where a well-dressed man, exuding confidence, settled into his seat. He was the type who liked to make his presence known. The kind of passenger who spoke just a little too loudly and expected service with a snap of his fingers. He glanced around at the other travelers, his gaze pausing on a blonde woman seated a few rows ahead. Something about her looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. As the flight attendants made their rounds, offering pre-flight drinks, the man smirked, watching as the blonde woman politely declined. That was when he decided to strike up a conversation. "Not a fan of first-class perks?" he said with a condescending chuckle. The woman looked up from her book, smiled politely, and responded, "Just here to enjoy the flight." Something about her calm demeanor irritated him. He thrived on reactions, on getting under people's skin. So, he pressed on. "You look familiar," he continued. "Wait, don't tell me. You're a celebrity, right?" She let out a soft laugh. "Not quite." "Oh, come on. I know I've seen you somewhere. Politician, lawyer, something like that?" "Now," she nodded. "Yes, something like that." That was all she said before returning to her book, but the man wasn't done. He wasn't the type to let things go, especially when he sensed an opportunity to impress or humiliate someone. A flight attendant arrived, offering him another drink. As she poured, he decided to turn his attention back to the blonde woman. "You know, I just remembered," he said, raising his voice slightly. "You're Pam Bondi, aren't you? Florida's former Attorney General?" This time she looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "That's right," the man smirked. "Oh wow, I didn't think someone like you would be flying commercial." She arched an eyebrow. "And what do you mean by that?" "Oh, you know," he said with a dismissive wave. "Big-time politicians usually have their private jets. Guess times are tough, huh?" A few nearby passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Pam remained composed, unfazed by his remarks. "Well," she said evenly, "I believe in being practical. No need for extravagance when a commercial flight gets the job done just fine." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "So, what brings you here, some big case? Or are you just out here enjoying retirement?" She smiled. "Just traveling." But the man wasn't done. He leaned back in his seat, loudly declaring, "You know, I never understood politicians. Always making rules for others while living, by a different set of them. Must be nice, huh?" A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. One even nudged a companion as if warning them to stay out of it. Pam, however, remained cool. "I think you might be confusing me with someone else." "Oh, I don't think so," he shot back. "You were Attorney General of Florida, right? Some people say you were a little too friendly with certain powerful figures. That's what I heard." Pam set her book down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "And did you also hear about the cases I fought for victims of human trafficking? Or the consumer protection laws I helped enforce? Or do you just prefer the gossip?" The man hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her firm but measured tone. "I mean," he stammered, "politicians always have some controversy, don't they?" Pam nodded. "They do. And sometimes people prefer to focus on narratives rather than facts. But I'm not here to change your mind, just trying to enjoy my flight." At that moment, a flight attendant approached. "Ms. Bondi, is there anything I can get you?" The man noticed how respectful the attendant was, almost deferential. It was clear Pam Bondi wasn't just another passenger. She commanded respect, even in silence. He suddenly felt a shift in the air. He had been playing a game, mocking her, but now he was starting to realize that he was out of his depth. Other passengers had been watching. Some had their phones out, not recording but clearly prepared to if things escalated. The man's bravado began to wane. He cleared his throat. "Well, I was just making conversation," he muttered. Pam simply nodded and picked up her book. Again. But the lesson had been learned. Some people aren't as easily rattled as you think. And when you pick the wrong person to mock, you might just end up regretting it. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by an awkward silence. He reached for his drink, taking a long sip as if that might somehow erase the tension lingering in the air. But it was too late. He had drawn too much attention to himself, and now he had to sit with the consequences. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, remained composed. She had dealt with far more intense confrontations in her career, from courtroom battles to public scrutiny. A smug passenger on a first-class flight wasn't going to rattle her. But the man wasn't quite ready to give up. His pride demanded some kind of redemption. "So," he said after a moment, forcing a casual tone, "what's life like after politics? You enjoying retirement?" Pam glanced up, offering a small smile. "Retirement? I don't think I'd call it that. I'm still very much involved in legal work and advocacy." "Oh yeah?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Pam set her book aside once again. If this man wanted a conversation, she'd give him one, but on her terms. "Well," she said, "after leaving office, I worked with the White House on human trafficking initiatives, helping push policies that protected victims and prosecuted traffickers. I also worked on issues related to consumer fraud, making sure corporations were held accountable when they took advantage of people. And now, I continue to provide legal expertise in various capacities." The man blinked. He had expected some generic response, maybe something about corporate consulting or sitting on a board somewhere. He hadn't expected that. "Wait, so you actually," he started, then paused. "You actually worked on all that stuff?" Pam nodded. "Yes." The man hesitated. He had been ready to mock her, to paint her as just another politician writing on connections. But her answer had thrown him off balance. "Well," he finally muttered, "I guess that's decent." Pam chuckled softly. "Decent?" He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware that the other passengers were still listening. He had made a fool of himself, and now he was scrambling to recover. "I just mean, I didn't know that about you." "That's the thing about assumptions," Pam said, her tone gentle but firm. "They're often based on incomplete information." The man nodded slowly, processing her words. He had spent the last 10 minutes trying to provoke a reaction, but now he found himself humbled instead. The flight continued in relative silence. Pam returned to her book, and the man for once kept to himself. Every now and then he stole a glance in her direction, but he didn't say another word. As the plane prepared for landing, a flight attendant walked by, offering last-minute refreshments. The man, still feeling a bit foolish, glanced at Pam. "Can I get you something?" he offered, as if a drink or a snack might somehow make up for his earlier behavior. Pam smiled politely. "That's kind of you, but I'm fine." He nodded, then hesitated before adding, "Look, I didn't mean to come off like a jerk earlier." Pam regarded him for a moment before replying, "I know." And with that, the plane touched down, marking the end of an encounter the man would never forget. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the man couldn't shake the weight of his own embarrassment. He had entered the flight with the usual arrogance he carried through life, but now he felt exposed, outmatched not by insults or aggression, but by something far more effective: calm confidence and undeniable facts. Passengers around him started gathering their belongings, unbuckling seatbelts and stretching after the long flight. The energy in the cabin had shifted back to the usual post-landing routine, but the man still felt the eyes of those who had witnessed his failed attempt at mockery. He watched as Pam Bondi calmly packed up her things, adjusting her coat with the same grace she had maintained throughout the flight. There was something about her poise that made him feel even smaller. Still, his ego wouldn't let him leave without some kind of redemption. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "what's next for you? More politics?" Pam glanced at him, with a knowing smile. "I go where I'm needed." Something about the way she said it made the man realize that her influence wasn't limited to a title or a position. She wasn't like the politicians he had imagined, those who faded into irrelevance once they left office. No, she was still making an impact, still holding power, just in a different way. He hesitated before speaking again. Listen, I guess I judged you before I knew anything. That was, probably not my best moment. Pam gave him a small nod. Most people do that. The important part is whether you learn from it. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, I guess I just did. The moment passed, and as the line of passengers began to move, Pam stood, retrieving her carry-on with ease. The flight attendant who had shown her so much respect earlier gave her a polite farewell. Have a great day, Ms. Bondi, the attendant said. Thank you, Pam responded warmly before turning toward the exit. The man lingered for a moment, watching as she stepped off the plane. He had spent the entire flight trying to belittle her, only to realize that he had underestimated her completely. As he finally gathered his own belongings and shuffled toward the exit, he muttered under his breath, well, that backfired. And as he stepped off the plane, he couldn't help but feel that he had walked away with something unexpected. An important lesson about respect, assumptions, and the quiet power of true confidence. As the man stepped into the airport terminal, he still couldn't shake the lingering embarrassment. He had entered that flight thinking he was the smartest person in the room, or at least in first class. Now, as he walked toward baggage claim, he felt the weight of his miscalculation. The moment replayed in his head. The way he had smirked. The way he had tried to poke at Pam Bondi, assuming she was just another politician clinging to relevance. But in the end, she hadn't needed to defend herself with anger or arrogance. She had simply let the truth speak for itself. He sighed, pulling out his phone to check for messages. As he scrolled, a headline popped up on his newsfeed. Pam Bondi's continued fight against human trafficking and consumer fraud. Curious, he clicked the link. The article detailed her post office work, highlighting her efforts to take down major corporations engaging in fraud and her continued advocacy for human trafficking victims. The man frowned. He had spent the flight assuming she was just another politician who cashed in on connections. But reading this article, he realized she was still in the trenches, fighting for causes most people wouldn't bother with once they left public office. And here he was, thinking he had her all figured out. As he stood near the baggage carousel, the same flight attendant who had served them earlier walked by. She gave him a knowing glance and said, "Not who you thought she was, huh?" He chuckled awkwardly. Not even close. The flight attendant smiled. Yeah, most people don't realize who they're talking to until it's too late. The guy. Man nodded slowly, processing the lesson. He had made a fool of himself, not because he was outright rude, but because he had underestimated someone based on his own assumptions. He had tried to mock her, but in the end, he was the one who had been humbled. Just then, he spotted Pam Bondi a few feet away, pulling her suitcase from the conveyor belt. For a brief moment, she glanced in his direction. Their eyes met, and she gave him a polite, almost amused smile before turning and walking away. The man sighed and shook his head. Next time, he thought, maybe I'll think before I speak. And with that, he grabbed his bag and headed toward the exit, carrying with him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget.